Walter Bramble and the Bakery That Wakes Before the Village. Chapter 1. The Room Above the Ironmonger. Walter Bramble had come to Nether Hadley for the walking, and had spent most of his first day sitting down. This was not a failure. It was, he had decided, rather the point. He had walked as far as the stone bridge at the bottom of the High Street, and there he had found a bench with a view of the water. And there he had remained for an hour and a half, watching a heron decide against fishing. By the time he stood up again, the afternoon had gone soft at the edges, and he had climbed back up the hill quite slowly, stopping twice to admire nothing in particular. The room he had taken was above an ironmonger's shop halfway up the hill. It was reached by a staircase so narrow that he had to carry his bag in front of him, like a man delivering something fragile. The room itself was small and low, and entirely pleasant. There was a bed with a green blanket. There was a wardrobe that smelled faintly of cedar, and more strongly of every coat that had ever hung in it. There was a chair by the window, and a lamp beside the chair, and a shelf holding 4 paperbacks left behind by 4 different people over what must have been several years. Walter had read the first page of 3 of them, and then gone to bed at 10:30, which was early for him, and this was his mistake. He woke at 2:10. He knew it was 2:10 because he had a small travelling clock that his wife had bought him a very long time ago in a shop in Salisbury, on a day when it had rained so hard they had gone into 3 shops they had no interest in simply to stay dry. The clock had a face the size of a 2-pound coin, and a tick you could only hear at night. He listened to it for a while in the dark. There is a particular quality to being awake in a strange room. In your own house you can find the door with your eyes shut. You know which floorboard complains and which one merely sighs. But a borrowed room keeps its secrets a little longer, and lying in it at 2 in the morning, you become aware that you are a guest of the building itself, and that the building has been awake far longer than you and will be awake long after. Walter lay still and listened to Nether Hadley. The town was doing very little. There was wind moving along the roofline, not hard, just enough to lift and settle. Somewhere below, a gutter was giving back the last of yesterday's rain, 1 drop at a time, into what sounded like a metal grate. Further off, so far off it might have been imagined, a train went through somewhere without stopping. He turned over. The green blanket was heavy in the way that old blankets are heavy, and he had liked that at 10 o'clock, and was less certain about it now. He turned back. At 2:25 he sat up and put his feet on the floor, which was cold, and said aloud to nobody at all, "Well then." He did not put the lamp on. Instead, he pulled the chair a little closer to the window and sat in it in his pyjamas, with the green blanket around his shoulders, like a man in a painting of somebody far more interesting. And he looked out at the street. The High Street of Nether Hadley runs downhill in a slow curve, so that from halfway up you can see the whole of it laid out below you, one roof stepping down to the next, all the way to the bridge. In daylight, it is honey-coloured. At night, it is the colour of an old photograph, greys and browns and a soft orange, where the 2 remaining street lamps still work. Nothing moved. There were no lit windows. There was not 1 lit window in the entire visible length of the town, and Walter found something oddly companionable in that, the idea that everyone was asleep, and he alone had drawn the short straw and been left on watch. Then he leaned forward slightly, because he was wrong. Right at the bottom, past the bridge, where a lane turned off to the left and vanished behind a wall, there was a light. It was low and warm and slightly yellow, And it was not a street lamp, because street lamps do not flicker when somebody walks in front of them. Walter watched it for perhaps 5 minutes. He was 68 years old, and he had learned that the ideas which arrive at 2:30 in the morning are usually best left where they fall. But he had also learned rather later in life than he would have liked that some of them are not. He put on his trousers and his shirt and his cardigan, and after some thought his coat as well. He found his shoes. He went down the narrow staircase sideways, holding the rail, and let himself out into the street. Chapter 2. The One Lit Window. The cold outside was not sharp. It was the soft, damp, early morning cold of a town in a valley, the kind that settles on your face rather than bites it, and Walter stood on the pavement for a moment and let it do so. Then he began to walk down the hill. There is no walking quite like walking through a sleeping town. Every sound you make becomes your responsibility. Walter's shoes on the wet stone were suddenly the loudest thing in the county, and he found himself placing his feet with care, rolling from heel to toe as though he were crossing a room where a baby had just gone down. He passed the butcher's, with its blind pulled and a white tray in the window holding nothing at all. He passed a shop that sold wool, which had a cat asleep in it in the window on a folded blanket, entirely unbothered. He passed the war memorial with its short list of names and its ring of railings, and he slowed as he always did, and read 2 of the names and walked on. The hill took him down past a chapel, then past a row of cottages whose doors opened straight onto the pavement. In one of them a clock chimed the 3/4 hour, muffled, from a hallway, and Walter thought about the fact that it had chimed at that moment for perhaps 150 years, whether or not anyone had ever been awake to appreciate it. The bridge at the bottom was a single stone arch with a low parapet, and the water beneath it ran shallow and quick over stones. He stopped in the middle out of habit, put both hands on the cold parapet, and looked down at a stretch of river he could hear far better than he could see. Then he turned left into the lane towards the light. The lane was called Doe Row. He had noticed the sign the day before, and had assumed it was one of those charming names that no longer means anything, like Fish Street in a town 9 miles from the sea. He revised this opinion now, because 30 yards along Doe Row, on the right, there was a wide window of small square panes, warmly and completely lit, and behind it there was flower in the air. Walter stood at a polite distance and looked in the way one looks into a lit window at night, which is to say, guiltily and for slightly too long. Inside there was a long wooden bench, scrubbed pale, and on it were rows and rows of dough. Not loaves yet, just pale rounds, sitting in cloth-lined baskets, waiting. Beyond the bench was a wall of shelves. Beyond that, a doorway into somewhere darker and redder, and the suggestion of great heat. And at the bench, with his back to the window, was a man in a white apron doing something slow with his hands. Walter had every intention of walking on. He would go back over the bridge and up the hill and lie down again and be pleasantly tired in the morning, and he would have this small private thing to think about, the lit window and the flower. The man at the bench turned round, saw him, and raised one hand in greeting, as if Walter were expected. There is no dignified way to be caught looking through a window at 3 in the morning. Walter raised a hand back. The man crossed the room, and the door opened, and warmth came out into the lane like something spilled. "You will be cold," the man said. "I am not particularly." "You will be. Come in or do not, but do not stand there deciding, because I'm letting all the heat out." Walter came in. The warmth met him properly then, and with it the smell, which was not the smell of baked bread, but the smell that comes before it. Yeast and flour, and something faintly sweet and faintly sour at once, warm wood. And underneath it all, the dry, mineral smell of a fire that has been burning for a long time. "Alfie Marsden," the man said, and did not offer his hand, because his hands were pale to the wrist with flour, and instead nodded in a way that did the same job. "Walter Bramble. You're not from here." "I am from Willowmere. I am staying up the hill, above the ironmonger." "Ah," said Alfie Marsden, "then you will not have slept. Nobody sleeps in that room the first night. It is the pipes. They stop at midnight and start again at 5, and in between the whole building thinks about it." He said this without any particular sympathy, as a man might state the depth of a well. "There is a stool by the flour bin," he added. "You are welcome to it. But I will tell you now, I am not going to be much company. I have got 120 to get out by 6. "I did not come for conversation," Walter said. Alfie Marsden looked at him for a moment. "No," he agreed. "People rarely do." Chapter 3. The warm dark. The stool by the flour bin was worn to a shine in the middle, and wobbled very slightly on one leg, and Walter sat on it and did not move for a long time. Alfie worked. This was the whole of it, and it was enough. He worked at a pace that could not be described as hurrying and could not be described as slow. A pace that had clearly been arrived at some decades ago and had not been revisited since. He took a round of dough from its basket, turned it out onto the bench, and shaped it with 3 or 4 movements of his hands. Then he set it aside and reached for the next one. Walter watched the hands mostly. They were wide and blunt and floured, and they did not seem to be thinking. There was a fold, a turn, a press with the heel of the palm, a quarter rotation, and the thing on the bench went from being a shapeless, pale mass to being a loaf, and there was no moment in between where you could see it happen. "How many is that?" Walter asked after a while. 41. "You are counting." "I am not counting, I know." The clock on the wall said 10 minutes to 3, and Walter had the strong sense that it always said something like that this room existed permanently at 10 minutes to 3, and the rest of the world merely visited. After a time, Alfie wiped his hands on his apron and said, "Come and see the proving room, if you are going to sit there all night." He led Walter through a low doorway into a smaller space at the back, and stopped and let him look. It was dark, or nearly. One bulb burned somewhere behind a shelf, the color of weak tea. The room was warm, in a way that Walter felt first on the backs of his hands, and then everywhere, a still and heavy warmth with no draught in it at all. And on every shelf, from floor to ceiling, dough was rising. There must have been 200 baskets. They sat in their rows in the half-dark, and each one held something pale that was very slowly getting bigger. It was not possible to see it happening, but if you stood still and looked at one basket for long enough, and then looked away and looked back, you found you could not swear it was the same size as before. "They do all the work in here," Alfie said quietly. "I only shape them. The rising is theirs." "How long?" "Overnight. 12 hours, some of them in the cold first, then a while in here to come round. You cannot rush it. Well, you can. There is machinery that will do the whole business in 90 minutes, and there is nothing wrong with the bread it makes, whatever anybody tells you. But it does not taste of anything much, and I do not know what I would do with the other 10.5 hours." Walter said nothing. He was listening, because the proving room was not silent. It was very nearly silent, which is a different thing entirely, and much better. There was the settling of cloth. There was the tick of something metal, cooling or warming. And there was very faintly, from all around, the sound of 200 small bubbles of air arriving in 200 loaves, a sound so small that it could not really be called a sound, more a texture in the air, like the noise a field makes on a hot afternoon. "You can hear them," Walter said. "You can, if you stop expecting to." They stood in the warm dark a while longer. Walter's shoulders, which had been up somewhere near his ears since he had left his bed, came down without being asked. Somewhere behind him a basket shifted 1/4 of an inch on its shelf, having grown into a space it had not previously required, and settled again. "Right," said Alfie. "That is enough standing about." He went back through to the bench, and Walter followed and took the stool again, and the shaping went on. 42, 43, 44. A cat came out from behind the flour sacks, looked at Walter with total indifference, and got up onto the end of the bench where the wood was warm from the wall. "That is balm," said Alfie, without looking up. "She catches nothing, and she never has." "Balm. It is what the froth on the top of the ale used to be called, and it is what they used to raise the bread with before yeast came in packets. My grandmother called it that. She would have called this whole room that, given the chance." Balm turned round twice in the way of cats, and lay down with her back against the wall and closed her eyes. Chapter 4. The Oven That Never Went Out. At some point after 3 o'clock, Alfie put down the dough he was holding and said, "Come and look at this then, since you are here." The doorway at the back of the bakery led into the oven room, and the oven room was the reason for everything else. The oven took up an entire wall. It was brick, painted white a long time ago, with an iron door in the centre no larger than a small dog, and a black handle worn to silver in the place where a hand goes. Above the door the brickwork had darkened in a broad, soft arch, the shape that heat makes over a very long time. The heat came off it in a slow wall. Walter stopped 4 feet away, and found he did not want to come closer, not out of fear, but out of something more like manners. 1843, Alfie said. That is when they laid it. There is a date scratched in the brick round the back, though you would have to take my word for it, because the back is behind the wall of the house next door, and has been since before the war. And it has been lit ever since. Alfie considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Nearly. It went out twice that we know of. Once in 1947 in the winter, when there was no coal to be had for anything, and my grandfather let it die rather than burn the shop furniture. He said it took 11 days to bring it back, and he did not sleep properly for a month after. And once in 1983 when the chimney was relined, and that was a planned thing, and he did not mind it as much, but he minded it. That is a long time for a fire. It is not the same fire, it is the same oven. There is a difference, though I have met people who like to say otherwise because it sounds better in the newspaper. He opened the iron door. Inside, the brick was the colour of a sunset, an even, deep, sauceless orange, and there was no flame at all. Walter had expected flame. He said so. No. You burn wood in it in the evening, and then you take everything out, ashes and all, and you sweep it. and what you are left with is a room made of stored heat. The bricks give it back for the next 8 hours. It is at its hottest at the start, which is why the bread that wants a hard crust goes in first, then the softer things. Then at the very end, when it is barely warm at all, you can put a dish of milk pudding in there and leave it and come back at lunchtime. And the temperature? There is no dial. There is a piece of paper. Alfie tore a corner from a paper flour bag, dropped it onto the oven floor, and shut the door. Walter counted to 9 before Alfie opened it again. The paper had gone the color of strong tea and was curling at one edge and had not caught. "That is right," said Alfie. "If it went black, too hot. If it did nothing, too cold. My grandfather taught me that, and his father taught him. And there is a man in Denmark who paid £2,000 for a machine that does the same job worse." He shut the door. They stood in front of it for a while. Walter found that he was warm all the way through for the first time in what felt like weeks, and that the warmth was going into him at the level of the bones rather than the skin, which is a different transaction altogether. "Do you mind it?" he asked. "The hours." Alfie leaned back against the bench. "I have not seen the sunrise from the other side in 31 years, he said. "Not properly. I see the light change through that window, and I know exactly what it is doing, but I'm always in here when it happens. My wife used to say I lived in a country of my own with a population of 1 and slightly better bread." Was she right? Entirely. She was right about nearly everything, and she was very kind about it, which I have since learned is rare. He picked up a cloth and wiped a bench that was already clean. "But no, I do not mind it. I have thought about whether I mind it at about this hour for a great many years, and the answer keeps coming back the same. There is nobody wanting anything from me between 1 and 5 in the morning. The bread does not want anything. It simply gets on with it, and I get on with it alongside, and at 6 o'clock I open the door and the world comes back in. That is a fair arrangement. Most people never get offered it." Somewhere in the proving room, another basket shifted on its shelf. Chapter 5. The First Loaves. At 4:20 the loading began, and Walter, without being asked, moved his stool out of the way. Alfie worked with a peel, which is a long, flat wooden spade with a handle the length of a man, and the handling of it was the most practiced thing Walter had seen in years. The loaf went on to the blade. The blade went into the oven, all the way to the back, level and smooth. Then a short, sharp pull, and the loaf stayed where it was put, and the peel came out empty. He did this 30 times without pausing. He did not measure the gaps between the loaves, and the gaps were all the same. "You will want to stand back for this bit," he said, and lifted a jug of water and threw about a cupful onto the oven floor, and shut the door fast. There was a hiss, and then a low, soft roar of steam behind the iron. "Steam keeps the crust soft for the first few minutes," Alfie said, "so the loaf can go on rising in the heat. Then it dries and the crust sets hard. If you get it wrong, you get a good loaf with a tight chest. If you get it right, you get the tearing." "The tearing?" "You will see, or hear, rather. Sit down." Walter sat. The next 20 minutes were, he thought afterwards, some of the most restful of his life, and nothing at all occurred during them. Alfie moved between bench and proving room, carrying baskets. The oven ticked. The clock ticked at a different speed, or seemed to. Balm the cat slept with one paw over her face. There was a radio on a shelf, and at some point Alfie turned it on, and it was so quiet that Walter could not make out a single word or tune. It was simply a low, warm murmur in the corner of the room, the sound of somebody being awake somewhere else, and it made the silence better rather than worse. At 5:10, the first loaves came out. They came out dark, much darker than Walter had expected, a deep chestnut brown, almost too dark at the ridges, and Alfie set them on a wire rack in a row of 6 and stood back. "Now," he said. "Listen." Walter listened. For a moment there was nothing. Then, from somewhere inside the first loaf, there was a small dry crack, a pause, then another from a different loaf, and then 2 together, and then a whole soft crackling scatter of them along the rack, tiny and continuous, like a stove settling or the first minute of rain on a window. "They sing when they cool," Alfie said. "The crust is set hard and the inside is still full of steam, and as it goes, the crust cracks to let it. Every one of those is a crack you could not see with a magnifying glass." Walter did not say anything for a while. The loaves went on ticking and crackling to themselves on the rack, cooling, quietly coming apart, in a way that made them better rather than worse. "I taught English for 35 years, he said eventually, "and I do not think I ever heard anything that made a better argument for anything." "For what?" "I'm not sure yet. For not rushing. For letting a thing finish by itself." Alfie made a low sound that was not quite a laugh. "They also make excellent toast," he said, and went to fetch the next tray. The smell had changed. Walter had not noticed it happening, but the raw, sweet, yeasty smell of the early hours had gone, and in its place was the other one, the one that everybody knows, the smell of bread that has just come out of an oven, which had filled the room to the ceiling and was now going under the door and out into Doe Row, where there was nobody yet to smell it. Nearly nobody. Somewhere out in the lane, a dog barked once, hopefully, and was told to be quiet by a voice too far away to make out. Chapter 6. The Town. Turning Over. The milk float came at 5:20, and Walter heard it before he understood what it was. A high electric whine coming up the lane and stopping outside. "That is Peter," Alfie said. "He will want 2. The door opened. A man of about 50 came in, wearing a coat over what was clearly a jumper worn to bed, said "morning" to Alfie, "morning" to Walter, as though Walter had always been there, put a bottle of milk on the end of the bench, took 2 loaves from the rack, wrapped them himself in paper from a stack that was evidently kept for the purpose, and left. The entire transaction contained no money and lasted 11 seconds. "He brings the milk, he takes the bread," Alfie said. "It has been like that since his father did the round. I could not tell you who is ahead. I do not think anybody has ever worked it out, and I would not want to be the one to start." At 5:30, a van pulled up further along, and there was the sound of a bundle of newspapers hitting a pavement, that flat, heavy slap that Walter had not heard in years and recognized instantly, and then the van moved on. At 6:20, a light came on in the house opposite. Then, 2 minutes later, another 2 doors down. Walter watched the lane through the window, and this was the part he had not anticipated and would remember longest. The town was coming back on, one window at a time, the way a fire catches. Somebody's kettle, somebody's bathroom light, a curtain going back on the first floor of the house at the corner, and a woman standing there for a moment in the grey, doing nothing at all, exactly as he had done 4 hours earlier, and rather higher up the hill. It happens in the same order every day, Alfie said, following his eye. Number 6, then the corner, then the 2 cottages, then the man with the dog. The dog is why I know it is 2:15. I have not needed the clock for 20 years, and I keep it wound out of politeness. The sky above the roofs had stopped being black. It was not light yet. It was that other colour, the one with no name, that is grey and blue and slightly green all at once, and against it the chimneys had gone from being absences to being shapes. Alfie was working faster now, but not with any sense of panic. Loaves came out, trays of small rolls went in and were out again in a quarter of the time. A shelf behind the counter that had been empty all night filled up from one end. Walter stood. I should go before I am in the way. You have not been in the way. You have been on a stool. All the same. Alfie wiped his hands and looked at the rack for a moment, and then chose a loaf from the middle of it, one of the first 6, and wrapped it in paper and held it out. Take that one. It is 4 in the morning bread. It is better, and I could not tell you why, and I've never charged anybody for it because I could not look them in the face while I did. Walter took it. It was still warm, not hot. Warm the way a stone is warm at the end of a good day, all the way through, giving it back slowly. Thank you, he said. Come tomorrow if you cannot sleep. Do not come if you can. That is the arrangement I have with about 4 people in this town, and it has never once been abused. He went back to the oven and had the door open before Walter reached the street. Chapter 7. The Long Way Home. The lane was blue. That was the only word for it. The air itself had colour in it now, and the walls of Doe Row, which had been black shapes when he came down, were showing their stone. Walter walked to the end of the lane with the loaf held against his chest inside his coat, both arms round it, which is not a dignified way for a grown man to carry bread, and was the only sensible way to carry that particular loaf on that particular morning. At the bridge he stopped again. The river had appeared. 4 hours ago it had been a sound with nothing attached to it, and now here it was, shallow and quick and brown and green, running over stones that were each individually visible, and it had been doing this the entire time. He stood and watched the water go under the arch and come out the other side. Then he turned up the hill and began to climb slowly, because there was no reason at all to do it quickly. The town he walked back through was not the town he had walked down. That one had been asleep, and this one was not, although it had not yet admitted it. Behind a window somebody was talking to somebody else in a low voice. A radio was on properly somewhere, with words in it. A gate went. In the window of the wool shop the cat had moved off the blanket and was sitting up, looking out, with the particular offended expression of an animal whose morning has begun without its permission. The smell came with him for the first 100 yards, and then he was above it, and it was gone, and he found he minded that more than he expected. Halfway up he passed a woman coming down in a coat over a nightdress, holding an empty basket, and she nodded to him and said, "Morning, morning." She had not looked at all surprised to meet a stranger on the hill at 6 in the morning, and Walter thought about that for the rest of the climb, and decided that in a town with a bakery like that one, she probably never was. The narrow staircase above the ironmonger was easier going up than it had been coming down. He let himself into the small, low room, and it had changed too, because there was grey light in it now, and the shabbiness the lamp had shown him last night had become something else entirely, the softness that old furniture has in early light. He put the loaf on the table by the window. He took off his coat and his shoes and sat down in the chair and did not go to bed, because he had discovered that he no longer particularly wanted to. The travelling clock said 7 minutes past 6. Outside, the ruse stepping down the hill had turned the colour of weak honey at the top and was still grey at the bottom, and the line between the two was moving very slowly downward, in the same way that dough rises, which is to say invisibly and entirely. Walter thought about the oven and the 11 days it had taken to bring it back in 1947, and a man he had never met before tonight, standing alone in a warm room, deciding at 3 in the morning, over and over across 31 years, that he did not mind. He thought about the loaves singing on the rack. He rested his head against the back of the chair. The green blanket was still on the bed where he had left it, and after a while he got up and fetched it and put it over his knees and sat back down and watched the light come down the hill towards him. It reached the ironmonger's roof at about 20 past 6. By then Walter Bramble was asleep in the chair, with his chin down and his hands folded, and a loaf of bread on the table beside him, going quietly cool. Down at the bottom of the hill, in a lane called Dough Row, a man in a white apron opened his door and set the sign out and put the kettle on for the first cup of tea he had allowed himself since 1 o'clock in the morning. And behind him, on the shelves in the warm dark of the proving room, the last few baskets went on doing the only thing they had ever been asked to do, which was to take their time. The end.